Welcome, friends, from a sacred island mountainside in the deep blue Aegean Sea. I bid you all good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is the Hellenic Light Podcast, where we explore everything Hellenic from a Hellenic point of view. And today, we'll be exploring arguably one of the most recognized names in human history. So sit back, make yourselves comfortable, and enjoy the podcast. We'll be getting to you very soon. Greetings, friends. Nice of you to join me. My name is Kirk, and you're listening to the Hellenic Light Podcast. Episode 1, Subject Achilles. Today, we will discover the truth of the man behind the myth according to the ancient sources available to us. I believe this is the first time in history that such an examination of Achilles will be undertaken, stripping away all myths to reveal a pragmatic and realistic biography that lies within the borders of our reality. An examination of a historical figure, not a mythological figure. A biography of a real man no different than a family member or your neighbor or even a friend. The ancient sources range from the contemporary to the Roman period. And of course, we will be selective in piecing together the puzzle in order to get a panoramic view of the historical Achilles. But before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity, seeing as this is my very first podcast, to take a moment and talk about my channel. This channel focuses on everything Hellenic from a Hellenic point of view. Essentially, history seen from only a Hellenic lens, meaning only Hellenic literature will be used. I don't care about what modern scholarship says or the subjective views of archaeologists. I don't care what the Egyptians had to say. I don't care what the Mesopotamians had to say. I don't care what any civilization connected to cuneiform has to say, or the Bible, or anything that's not associated with Hellenic literature. At times we will venture off to Roman sources where there are no Greek sources available, but these are the borders we will be working with on this channel. All of my readings are done in a pure Hellenic form, meaning what some people would refer to as modern Greek pronunciation. I will not be using the Erasmus or reconstructed system that is so favored by non-Greeks simply because they cannot pronounce Greek properly. And I completely disagree with this form of pronunciation, as it has a very hard Latin sound to it, not a melodic Greek sound. To a non-Greek, the system that I am using is called the Rochilian system, if I even pronounce it correctly, um, by Johann Rochelian, who lived in the 15th century and lived 10 years before Erasmus. This system was also supported by Heinrich Schliemann, the father of archaeology, who discovered Troy. And even though I learned to speak Greek, I still don't speak it like a Greek because native Greeks always tell me I have an American accent when I speak Greek. Regardless of my accent, in this manner, I feel we will get closer to what the ancient world was like through the eyes of the ancient Greeks according to their cultural knowledge. So now back to our subject. I believe in order to get a good grasp of things, the first thing we need to do is to set a timestamp so that we can have a proper Hellenic chronology of events. And the best event to use is, of course, the Trojan War. What we know is from the time the city of Ilium, Troy, was built, three kings ruled it until the Trojan War occurred. It was built by King Aeolus, and the city was named after him. Then King Laomedon, his son, ruled, and finally his son, King Priam. Now, modern scholarship agrees there is a city of Troy, and they have placed 9 layers to Troy, starting from Troy 0 all the way to Troy 9. Modern scholarship agrees that Troy 1 is dated at 3100 BC. And then they say the Trojan War with King Priam is dated anywhere from 1250 BC to 1180 BC. And they attribute Troy 6 or Troy 7, I believe, to that date. The problem with modern scholarship guesswork is how do they account for 3 generations spreading over 2,000 years? There's absolutely no logic to that. And 3 generations is generally 100 years traditionally, or at least the way the ancient Greeks evaluated 3 generations. Therefore, the most logical conclusion is that the Trojan War occurred 3010 BC and it ended at 3000 BC. This would give us the year of when Achilles died. This is also going to be the year that I will be anchoring as far as our Hellenic chronology goes for later podcasts and the exploration of Hellenic history. Everything will be pre or post Trojan War according to this date that we have just anchored. Just so you can get a clear picture, the classical period of Greek civilization, or the Golden Age of Greece, occurred about 700 years after this date. Rome was also founded about 500 years after the Trojan War, and therefore the building of Rome happened around 2500 BC. In short, 3000 BC was the end of the Bronze Age with the Trojan War and the beginning of the Iron Age. With this grounded date, we can actually begin to analyze the historical life of Achilles. His genealogy is as follows. Achilles' genealogy can be dated back to his great-great-great-grandfather, meaning his grandfather's grandfather, as has been documented in Hellenic literature. His name is King Myrmidon, and his son was Actor, and Actor had 2 sons named Aeacus and Miniotis, who was Aeacus's younger brother. Aeacus had 3 sons, Telamon, Phocus, and Peleus. Miniotis had Patroclus. Peleus had Achilles, and his brother Telamon had Ajax and Teucer, the archer. Therefore, according to Greek family lineage, Patroclus was the first cousin of Peleus and Telamon, making him the uncle of Achilles, Ajax, and Teucer. So we have Myrmidon, we have Actor, we have Aeacus and Miniotis. Basically, those are three generations. Myrmidon is the first, Actor is the second, Aeacus and Miniotis are the third. Telamon, Peleus, and Patroclus, the children of the two brothers, Aeacus and Miniotis, are the fourth. And the fifth generation is Ajax, Teucer, and Achilles. Achilles also had an older sister from Peleus' first marriage, and her name was Polydora. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, my father and his um, my father and his brother, the children of his brother, would make us first cousins. Now, my grandfather and my grand uncle, their children would be my father, and my grand uncle's children would be first cousins. So that's the Greek way of dividing family. It was generational. Not like the Italians, everyone's a cousin, regardless of generation. And only immediate direct family descendancy has titles like aunt, uncle, and so on and so forth. And the English, they even have a more confusing system. Uh, I don't even know how it works, but it's something like first cousin removed, and I don't even know how to make sense of that. But this is essentially the genealogy that we are working with. Um, I guess a good place to start is with his birth and early years. It wasn't until about 150 years ago that the government began documenting people's birthdays in order to keep track of their property. This is probably why, for any of you that have seen any old gravestones before the 19th century, at least in North America, there's never birthdays on them, just years. Before that, people celebrated their name day, which was usually given to them within the first 2 weeks of their life or by the first year. A name meant that the little being is suddenly an individual and a member of society. And of course, there was a baptism to symbolically cleanse the new little being from any mortal impurities that they may have inherited. Because a birth date is a relatively modern invention, modern historians and mythologists, for some reason, have given the date of June 7th as Achilles' birthday. I don't know why that day is attributed to him, and of course, it's symbolic. But since it's the only reference we have for a birthday, we'll just use it for amusement's sake. I guess that will make him a Gemini. Achilles would have died at the age of 32, and that would make his birthday June 7th, 3032 BC. And as far as I know, Achilles was the first human to have been documented as having a baptism, and ultimately the ritual of baptism that many of us go through was because of him. This would have happened at the age of 1 traditionally. How do I come to this conclusion? If we look at the Greek Orthodox Church, who continues the tradition of baptizing from Hellenic culture, it is usually done at the age of 1. The Church, like with many other rituals they perform, have been taken directly from the ancient Hellenic civilization. We also have an indicator from the myth that he was just a baby grabbed by the heel and dipped in the river Styx in some versions, and in other versions, he was placed over the fire. But he was a baby to be able to be grabbed by the heel and held. He must have been very small and very light. Regardless, there is a clear indicator that he was baptized. The next important event to occur in Achilles' life was his pedagogue, Phoenix, who was assigned to him while he was still an infant to begin his education. Phoenix lived in the palace and worked closely with his mother Thetis to teach him ethics, etiquette, manners, language, and logic. He was being groomed to be a king. Phoenix, as documented in Book 9 of the Iliad, recounts the child's primary re, recounts being the child's primary caregiver during these years. He describes Achilles as a fussy toddler who would only eat while sitting on Phoenix's lap, often spitting out wine and food in a state of childish hopelessness. It is even quite possible he may have been assigned to Achilles at the age of 1 or earlier, and definitely present from his earliest memories. Phoenix was one figure that was present with him his entire life, and he viewed him as a father figure, or at least like an extremely close family member. One of the few people who could speak to Achilles on whatever was on his mind, in his heart, and from his soul, without Achilles reacting in anger. Next to his parents, this is the only person that could have some kind of control or influence over Achilles, other than his uncle Patroclus, who was also with him his entire life. And for no other reason than the love and respect that they had for each other. The love and the trust Achilles had in this man was like no other, even though Achilles loved all his family very much. Book 9 also states that Phoenix taught Achilles to be both a speaker of words and the doer of deeds, basically talk the talk and walk the walk. If we interpret that correctly, to be a straightforward, honest, ethical man. He told him to be upstanding in both thought and action, which was another added layer to his character. And being in the palace with his mother, he also got rooted in his family ethics, the way his family lived life. Because the ancient Greeks understood that a child, by the time he reaches 4 years of age, if properly developed, understands right and wrong, and even has a sense of guilt, then they knew that those 4 first years were very important to be close to the family. Prior to those 4 years, little children don't have this type of knowledge usually. You can look at a 2-year-old, yell at him for doing something wrong, don't touch that, and he'll keep his hand on whatever it is and look at you directly in the eye without any understanding of what he's doing, whether it's right or wrong. So the first 4 years of his life were like any other Hellenic child, safe at home with the love of their mother, but of course groomed as a king. Phoenix must have been an extremely good man as well. Children, like dogs, have a good sense of a person's energy. These first 4 years of life were in an environment that was secure, loving, and very luxurious. This is what the young Achilles understood the world to be at that time. The first 4 years of education rooted his personality and essentially his inner self, his character. He must have shown remarkable advancement when compared to other children his age. This was something so distinguishable that he began an early education for his outwardly self. Usually, children begin this um, development of skills around 5 or 6 years old, which is when their formal education begins. Due to this remarkable advancement, he was sent to his grandfather Chiron, the centaur, to begin his formal education. Dictys of Crete describes that Chiron was the father of his mother Thetis, making him Achilles' grandfather from his mother's side. For the young Achilles, the palace life eventually became a distant memory. He was suddenly taken at 4 years of age to the mountainside of Mount Pelion and placed in the cave with his grandfather, the centaur Chiron, to begin his formal education. Now, this too, the centaur Chiron was no ordinary man. He was the great teacher of antiquity, not of scholars and professors. His students became heroes, legends, immortals, even demigods. This is how magnificent his school was in that cave, and this is where Achilles was placed. Just to sidestep for a moment, I would like to clarify that centaurs, depicted as half man, half horse, was a symbolic depiction of the first people to domesticate the horse. And when they were riding their horses, they looked like they were one creature altogether. This misunderstanding happened with the native Indians when the Spaniards first encountered them. Some native Indians seen them from a distance as shadowy figures and thought them to be a single animal. Hellenic legend has it that there were some wild bulls roaming the Thessalonian countryside and causing havoc. These centaurs went with their horses like cowboys to drive the bulls away, and this is how they became famous half man, half horse, and were given the name. They were the first equestrians. Their name literally means to puncture. Gentin in Greek and bull in Greek is Tavros. Kentavros, centaur. So Achilles, in the cave of Mount Achilles, with his grandfather, essentially in the cave in Mount Pelion was the first university, you might say, that didn't just create the scholars. Um, so now Achilles, in the care of his grandfather Chiron, who was in his 70s at the time, continued and supported his palace education to develop him as a human being to be the best that he can be. It seems Achilles throughout his entire childhood was taught to be the best that he could be and without imposing on anyone else to better himself. If he was to impose on anyone, he was to impose on himself to become better than what he was yesterday. It was this psychological state that produced a child to develop abilities that equal a grown man. A good example of such a human being in our time is Mike Tyson. Before he was 16, he was equated to the strength of a man. And Mike Tyson eventually developed into a wise old man, despite all the problems he went through in life. But Achilles also developed mentally and spiritually, along with physically. Let's explore a little bit what we know, what Achilles was taught during his stay with his grandfather, which lasted from the age of 4 to the age of, I would say 13, 8 years in total. His teachings of ethics and etiquette from infancy until 4 years old continued with his grandfather. Achilles learned that there's something called justice, and that is the difference between animal violence and human law or divine law. And through divine law, Achilles learned of the gods and to have reverence and respect for them, and how to honor them properly, as was his Pelasgian custom. He was taught the Hellenic alphabet, which by his time had been almost standardized to the same alphabet that is used today by modern Greeks. It was just a few years later when his fellow classmate and brother in arms at Troy, Palamedes, added a few letters and completed it and standardized it to the same alphabet that is used today. He began his horse training by this age, just as the native Indians did in North America, and there are people in the US who still begin their kids with horse riding at this early age. The myths we have of his two horses, Xanthos and Valios, gives us insight that he became a master horseman. It is said that even Xanthos had the power of speech, which tells us he was kind of a horse whisperer and had great communication with his animals, which is completely believable for at least some of us who have dogs. Another lesson he would have learned would have been botany and all the vegetation that surrounds them. Achilles learned to identify all the plant life by name. He also learned to recognize herbs and certain plants, so he knows what to eat and what not to eat. And he would have knowledge how to prepare pharmaceuticals and how to dress wounds and later on even perform surgery. In the Iliad, while dressing Patroclus' wound, he is passing on his knowledge to him as well. This reveals that Achilles was as a young boy, wanted to be helpful to others in the best way he could. To heal a person is one of the greatest things someone could do for another. So he was taught botany for survival so that he would know what plants are edible. And he was taught botany as medicine and pharmaceuticals for healing, and of course, surgery later on. He was taught music and the lyre, or the kithara. Music was a very important Hellenic lesson because it taught one about harmony and resonance and how to align one's soul in the same way with universal harmony. This is why the Iliad, when the embassy finds him in his tent, he isn't cleaning his armor, he's playing his lyre and singing about the glories of men. Chiron also taught Achilles prophecy and natural law, or in other words, the government of Zeus. Astronomy was another lesson Achilles learned, how to read the stars, and through that he can know the seasons and the time and astronomical markers and celestial events. And the knowledge of the stars also assisted him with navigation. And there is the lesson of hunting and wild combat. So through hunting and wild combat with bears, boars, and lions, he developed his physical prowess, his panther-like reflexes, and how to kill quickly. Humans were not at the same level as animals in battle, and that's why he was able to totally dominate his human opponents. Achilles was able to run down animals without the aids of dogs and how to handle the heavy Pelian ash spear, a weapon so massive that no other person was able to use it except for his grandfather Huron. He hunted deer and ran as fast as them. This is how he got the term swift-footed Achilles. To a child at that time, all these lessons were things Achilles really enjoyed, and because he had his inner drive to be the best he could be, he pursued all these with great interest, which made him exceed more than any other child has ever exceeded. By the time he reached the age of 12, Achilles had the skill, the power, and the athleticism to be able to compete with men. His fame reached throughout the entire Hellenic civilization. He essentially was on the same level or category as Heracles and Theseus. He had all the markings of greatness engraved in his character. And not only that, he was a very tall boy with strong legs, a deep chest, brown hair, and he was extremely handsome. His time with his grandfather was a hard lesson, but one he enjoyed. This education elevated him above other men uh, to be mentally strong, physically strong, and spiritually strong. And this inner drive transformed him into the warrior that has never been matched in history. Achilles was destined for fame whether the Trojan War occurred or not. He just had that kind of personality. But one of the worst attributes he possessed was a childish anger that raged to extremes. So here we have a well-cultured boy, highly intelligent, very educated, skilled in many arts, and excelling beyond all others, but with an anger problem. If there wasn't a Troy to immortalize him, there was an entire Greece that he probably would have conquered had he not gone to Troy. At the age of 7, he gets a visit from his father, accompanied by Orpheus, just before they leave for their Argonaut expedition, as documented in the Argonautica by Orpheus. What happens is they are in the cave, and Chiron asks a young Achilles to bring his lyre over to him. They decide to sing to each other, probably the two greatest musicians of the time, and Orpheus known or regarded as the greatest musician ever. The centaur Chiron sings of the Kendromachi, basically the war between the centaurs and the Lapiths, the battle between them at the wedding. Orpheus then takes the lyre and he sings of cosmogony. He sings of how the heaven, the earth, and the sea. He sings of divine force, of the eternal nature of the soul, and the secrets of the gods. It was like us in our days attending an Elvis Presley concert, I would assume. Achilles is described to have been transfixed by Orpheus's song. Chiron, pleased by Orpheus's song, gives Orpheus a leopard skin to honor Orpheus for the beautiful song he sang. And then Peleus and Orpheus depart to join the Argonauts. It is highly likely that it was a very sad event seeing his father leave. It is said that Hercules, during his labors, came to visit his old teacher when Achilles just began his education with his grandfather. Chiron was his teacher as well, and from what we can gather, his first student. That initial meeting must have had a great impact on a young Achilles, having met the most famous man in all of Greece. It probably inspired him to be like Hercules. But the second meeting years later was very tragic. It was a very tragic situation and very emotional for both Hercules and Achilles. The second time, Hercules was at war with the centaurs, and they ran for protection to the cave of Hieron. Hercules was probably in his 60s by now, but still a force to be reckoned with. As he was shooting his arrows and killing these ancient cowboys, Hercules ended up shooting an arrow and missed his target and accidentally struck his teacher, Hieron. He immediately cut his attack on the centaurs and ran to his teacher and pulled out the arrow. He did his best to try and save him, uh, with Achilles' assistance, of course, and all the medical knowledge they had, they put to use. Unfortunately, the poison-tipped arrow and the great age of the old man would bring him to an end of his life. And the tragedy lies in the total helplessness of everyone involved. Hieron, the greatest doctor in Greece, who taught Asclepius, the god of medicine, whose knowledge could not save him. Heracles, the man who could defeat anyone, the strongest man that has ever existed, and was completely helpless. And there was young Achilles, who was holding on to his grandfather's hand and crying profusely, repeating to him not to die. Yet, despite all their combined strength, tears, and medical knowledge, none of them could conquer the absolute irreversible poison of the Hydra, which was laced on the arrow. Basically, the tip of the arrow was laced with snake poison. The old man's death was something that could not be avoided, and it was at this point that Achilles, maybe 13 years of age, returned back to his palace, most probably with Hercules. It is said he could not stop crying for 9 days. It was truly a heartbreaking and tragic incident for all involved. The next major event to occur in Achilles' life was on the island of Skyros. Now, there's conflicting information on this issue, and what is commonly known is that his mother sent him there to hide him from being called to war, and he was made to cross-dress and pretend he was one of the princesses. This story is highly unlikely that a boy that was so manly would dress as a woman. That would be an ultimate insult and a very shameful act for someone like that. We do have two other accounts of what occurred, and the most likely one is that he was sent there probably for a vacation, as Darius the Phrygian states. He was sent there as a guest and spent some time there where he fell in love with one of the princesses, and mating with her, he ended up leaving her pregnant with a child. If Achilles was aware that he had a child with her, it is completely unknown, but there's no information regarding he had any contact with his child. He must have been uh, about the age of 15 when he impregnated her, the princess Didamia. Didam, Didamia. Diadamia in Greek. And it is certain that she gave the child his name, either Pyrrhus or more commonly Neoptolemus. Achilles once again returned to his palace in Phthia. The Trojan War is said to have initiated because King Priam decided he wanted his sister Hesione back, and he sent the embassy on a diplomatic mission to Greece to ask for her back from all the kings. The mission turned out to be disastrous, and the embassy returned empty-handed back to Troy. King Priam was furious with the outcome, and he authorized his son Paris to take a fleet to Greece. Paris, or Alexandros. Officially, Alexandros' mission was still to retrieve Priam's sister, his aunt, but if the Greeks refused, Alexandros was authorized to take a Greek noblewoman hostage to force a trade. This directly led to Alexandros abducting Helen of Sparta, igniting the Trojan War. He was lucky because at the time all the kings of Greece were on the island of Crete to accept their inheritance that was left to them by King Atreus. And it was during their absence that he looked upon Helen and she looked at him, and they both instantly fell in love with each other. And she voluntarily left with Alexandros. The leaders discovered the news. They left Crete and gathered at Sparta to figure out exactly what they should do about this abduction. They decided that they were going to call on all the leaders throughout Greece to go to war, and they decided that they were going to plan this war at Argos, where King Diomedes was to host the leaders. The leaders of the Greek side gathered there, and Achilles came as well, and it is said that Achilles was in his first years of his manhood, a noble youth and handsome, and of course eager for war. This would bring him to about the age of 22, since 19 is considered manhood, and if it was the first years, we can put it at 22. It was there that they decided Agamemnon would be the leader of the entire army, otherwise known as the King of Kings. Achilles, Ajax, and Phoenix were appointed leaders in charge of the naval fleet, and they gave Palamedes, Diomedes, and Odysseus joint command of the army in camp, and they gave themselves 2 years to prepare. In the end, it took them 5 years to actually gather at Aulis, where all the leaders and the armies came together. Achilles, now 27, came equipped with 50 ships and 50 men on each ship, totaling an army of 2,500 Myrmidons. With him was his uncle Patroclus, his guardian Phoenix, his sister's son, his nephew Menestheus, who was one of the squadron leaders of the Myrmidons. The Myrmidons, unlike the other soldiers from the other kingdoms, were not citizens who became soldiers. They were professionally trained soldiers, and they were a standing army. Other than Achilles, Ajax had a standing army as well, professional soldiers. I truly believe the Myrmidons designed what is known as the Corinthian helmet. It is a helmet that covered the face and had eyes for slits, or rather slits for eyes. And this Corinthian style helmet gave them an ant-like look, and it was extremely intimidating. And it was later adapted by the Greeks and continued to be used throughout classical antiquity. Their armor also consisted of breastplates, belts, and the leather straps that went down to the knees, greaves or shin pads to cover the legs, and of course their helmets had horsehair plume, as described in the Iliad. They had the classical depiction of Greek armor, unlike what modern scholars believe the Dendra armor, which looks very heavy and very clumsily. They believe that was used in the Bronze Age, but I believe that was a charioteer's armor. Sorry, what's wrong with my speech? And of course, all the ancient depictions from antiquity of the Trojan War always depicted the classical style armor. They never depicted this dendra style armor in their vases, in their sculptures, so on and so forth. Achilles also had his two cousins there, Telamone and Ajax, and his half-brother Teucer, the archer from Salamis, who brought their own armies with them, and of course his classmate in Hieron's cave, Palamedes, with his army. So he was surrounded by a lot of family and friends. They eventually gathered at Avlis, and eager to set sail, a plague had hit the forces, and thousands of men died along with the animals, laying waste to everything that stood in their way. There was no end to the death as far as the Greeks were concerned. This, they believe, was caused because Agamemnon had killed a she-goat in the sacred grove of Artemis. And to make full atonement for this disrespectful act to the goddess, Agamemnon was ordered to sacrifice his oldest daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon was completely against this and would not proceed with such a sacrifice. The army got angry and began to get restless, and the leaders were worried that they might become an undisciplined mob. They stripped Agamemnon of his command, and they placed 4 men in charge of the entire army, the men being Palamedes, Diomedes, Telamone and Ajax, and Idomenes, the king of the Cretan army. But regardless of the change of command, the plague continued to rage on with unstoppable death. And then antiquity's greatest criminal, Odysseus, decided to pretend that he was returning back to his island because he was so angry that Agamemnon would not sacrifice his daughter, but really he went to Mycenae. He had forged the letters supposedly from Agamemnon, and he went to Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra with it. The letter stated that Achilles was refusing to sail to Troy and holding back the entire army unless he married their oldest daughter, Iphigenia, who was promised to him. So she should send her daughter there with a dowry because Achilles is waiting for her. When Agamemnon discovered what happened, he wanted to flee, but the army forced him to stay, or the leaders forced him to stay. Odysseus, Menelaus, his brother, and the seer Calchas were in charge of the sacrifice. When they began to adorn the girl and dress her, the sky suddenly darkened, thunder was heard, and lightning was flashing. The earth and the sea were shaking, and it was topped off with a powerful whirlwind. The 3 of them were suddenly in a state of fear and confusion and did not know what to do. At first they were frightened by the weather, but then they were worried the army might suffer some harm if they did not go through with the sacrifice. So while all this was happening, Achilles received a personal letter from Clytemnestra along with a huge amount of gold. Once he realized what was happening, he dropped everything he was doing and rushed to the grove, shouting at Menelaus, Odysseus, and Calchas to keep their hands off the girl, or else he would kill them right on the spot. He freed the girl, and right at that moment the weather cleared up and a deer appeared right at the altar. So they took that as a sign and they sacrificed the deer. The plague coincidentally also stopped, and Achilles, with the other 3, decided that the best thing to do was entrust the girl to the king of the Scythians. And from there she was sent to Scythia, and specifically Colchis. That's where Jason and the Argonauts went. After all this happened, the army decided that they wanted Agamemnon to lead the army again, and he was reinstated as the leader of the entire forces. Several days later, the armada began to sail. On their way to Troy, they got caught up in strong winds and storms again, and they were blown off course, and they eventually landed at Mysia. The king there was Telephus, a son of Heracles, and he had an army stationed along the shore, or guards stationed along the shore, ready to kill anyone that landed. Achilles and his fleet landed, as did Ajax and his fleet, and began killing the guards that were stationed there and the rest of the soldiers, who eventually began to retreat. King Telephus came down to meet them with the rest of his army. During the battle, Achilles injured Telephus in the leg with his spear. By the end of the day, they called a truce so that they can collect their dead and cremate them. When Achilles and Ajax found out that they were in the wrong kingdom and they injured the wrong man, especially a son of Hercules, they both went to King Telephus and they apologized to him for the great misunderstanding. Achilles even used his medical knowledge to cure Telephus of his wound. Eventually, they had to return back to Greece and regrouped after 4 more years of preparation. They regrouped at Argos to set sail for Troy in the 9th year since they began planning this war. Achilles was now 31 years old when they made their second attempt at Troy. This time they made it to their destination, and again they were met with resistance at the shores of Troy by Aeneas. It wasn't until Ajax and Achilles landed their army on the shores that they began to push back the Trojans, even instilling fear in them. They eventually retreated completely back into their city. That's when the rest of the Greek forces landed, and they decided that Achilles and his cousin Ajax should be at the either end of the camp to protect the rest of the army. After the Greek army settled in and established their camp, Achilles took a few ships and attacked the island of Lesbos, where he easily took it. He returned, and then he took all his forces and began plundering and pillaging the cities along the coast of Asia Minor. The neighboring people of these cities he destroyed flocked to him in peace and promised him half of their crops if in return he would leave their fields unharmed and leave them alone. He made treaties with these people and exchanged pledges of peace with them. Achilles all in all destroyed a couple of islands, 11 cities along the coast, and 12 cities inland. And that's not including the peace treaties he made with the other cities. As Achilles was causing havoc and destruction south of Troy, along Asia Minor and within Anatolia, his cousin Ajax was doing the same thing north of Troy, with Thrace and within Anatolia, specifically Phrygia, with equal glory to Achilles. They both happened to return at the same time, and when they entered the camp with all their booty they had collected, the men lined up and they watched them and cheered as they entered one at a time, as if they were gods returning. Now, the details of the Trojan War are quite interesting, especially amongst the 3 different versions that we have, but I will get to the Trojan War at a later podcast. With regards to Achilles, though, I would like to say that in the 10th year, at the age of 32, Achilles fell in love with Hector's sister, Polyxena. He first laid eyes on her at the temple of Apollo, which was neutral ground to both Greeks and Trojans, as they went there unarmed, regardless of what was happening within the war. Achilles, on first seeing her, fell madly in love with her and attempted to negotiate with Hector for his sister, and was even willing to pull out of the war if Hector allowed him to marry his sister. Hector, on the other hand, decided this was a great opportunity to get the entire army out rather than accept Achilles pulling out only. He wanted the whole army to pull out. This deeply troubled Achilles, and for days he was in a lovesick haze, not knowing what to do exactly. At some point during one of the battles, Achilles' hand was struck by an arrow from Hector's brother Helenus, and he had to pull out of the fight for a while until his hand recovered. It was during this time that his uncle Patroclus put on his armor and went to fight the Trojans, where he eventually was killed by Hector. His grief for the death of his uncle was completely unbearable for him, even worse than when his grandfather died at the hands of Hercules. Then in Book 3, paragraph 15 of the Trojan newspaper written by Dictys of Crete, of which I will read to you, this was the end of Hector. It says the following. After a few days, news was suddenly brought that Hector and a few other men had set out to meet Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. Why she was coming to Priam's aid, whether for money or simply because of her love of war, was uncertain. Her race, being naturally warlike, was always conquering the neighboring peoples and carrying the Amazon standards far and wide. Accordingly, Achilles chose a few faithful comrades and set out to lay an ambush for the Trojans. He caught them off guard. They were trying to cross the river, and he surrounded and slew them before they knew what had hit them. Hector and all those who were with him were killed, with the exception of one of Priam's sons, whom Achilles captured, and having cut off his hands, sent him back to Troy to tell what had happened. The death of Hector was the worst blow that the Trojans suffered from, and of course for the royal family. They left them completely distraught, Troy's favorite son. Queen Hecuba wanted revenge for killing her most beloved son, and therefore she devised a plan to have Achilles killed. She sent word to Achilles that she was willing to marry her daughter to him, and that she would like him to meet at the temple of Apollo to make arrangements for the marriage. This was during the summer solstice, June 21st, when Thymbrian Apollo was to be honored, and arrangements for the wedding were to be discreetly made. And Achilles, completely delighted that he was going to marry the woman he fell madly in love with, was quite anxious to go there and make arrangements. In Book 4, paragraph 11, it describes the death of Achilles, again from Dictys of Crete. It says the following. Meanwhile, Alexander and Deiphobus, having formed a plot, approached Achilles as if to confirm the agreement of Priam in order to incur no suspicion. Alexander, he was wearing a sword, stopped near the altar and faced away from our leader. Achilles was carrying no weapon, thinking there was nothing to fear in the temple of Apollo. Then Deiphobus, when the time seemed right, came up to Achilles, and with flattering congratulations for the terms he had made, embraced him, and hanging upon him, refused to let go, until Alexander, with the sword drawn, rushed forward and thrust 2 blows into the victim's side. When they saw that he was dying, they departed in haste and returned to the city, with their very important mission accomplished beyond the fondest hopes. Odysseus, who had seen them leave, said, "Something is wrong. Why are these men so excited? Why are they frightened and rushing like this?" And thereupon he and the others, meaning Ajax and Diomedes, entered the grove and looking around discovered Achilles stretched on the ground, already half dead with the loss of much blood. Then Ajax said, "We know for a fact that no one could have defeated you in a fairly fought contest, but as is clear, you are undone by your own ill-advised rashness." And Achilles, breathing his last, said, "Deiphobus and Alexander overpowered me. They came in the matter concerning Polyxena, deceitfully, treacherously." As he lay there dying, our leaders embraced him and kissed him farewell. Great was the grief, and when he was dead, Ajax shouldered the body and carried him out of the grove. Achilles was cremated, and his ashes were placed together in the same urn with that of his uncle Patroclus. And that, friends, was the life of the historical Achilles. Unfortunately, I did not explain too much about his character so that we get a better understanding of the real man's character. It was more a description of the events of his life. And if people are interested in this type of information, please leave me a comment in the comment section, and I will do a part 2 on Achilles' character. I'm looking forward to the comment section. Please comment, share your thoughts, any ideas, but keep it within a Hellenic lens. I don't want to hear anything about Hittites and Watusa and all that nonsense. And if anyone wants to support the channel, you know what to do. You've heard it on every other channel. Please like and subscribe. Thank you. I hope this was interesting and informative, and I thank you kindly for your time, for joining me, for listening to me. Till we meet again, friends. Sin Theo.